gentlemen. It's Justin Johnson. We're going on to our fourth year. We're on the academic integrity of arts and humanities. We're on the module A225 of Block 1, Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840. It was edited by Paul Lawrence. On influence the youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. When we read, it's good to reference our reading, record our reading so we can listen back over our notes. We're on the Industrial Revolution, Unit 2, page 80. It's very important to reference your reading, to come back and listen to your notes, and you can preview where you left off. Villages where there was no other employment proved adept at resisting the introduction of machines that might take away their work. Randall, 1989. As will be explored in Unit 3, machinic braking and other forms of assistance to new ways of working were widespread in Britain in the early 19th century. Industrial development in Wales was different again. Wales, like Scotland, was a poor country until the 19th century, and there was little local capital to invest in new development. Much of the economy was orientated to external markets, such as the cattle trade, where cattle were bred in the Welsh hills, but most of the profit went to the middlemen who fattened the cattle on their way to the market in London. Two early industries, slate quarrying in North Wales and coal mining near Swansea, long remained small scale. Improved transport links to the rest of Britain were often fatal to local industries, such as woolen manufacture, which had led local needs but could not compete with cheaper wares from Yorkshire. The great exception to this picture of small-scale development was the town of Merthyr Tydfil in the upper valley of the River Taff. The combination of iron ore, wood for charcoal, and coal made the area ideal for iron manufacture. And the iron industry developed rapidly in the last decades of the 18th century and the first ones of the 19th. The industry was dominated by a few large companies, and by 1840, the Dowlais Ironworks were the largest in the world. Evans, 1989. Yet for a long time, Merthyr had little impact on Wales beyond the local area to visitors. It was the very isolation of this industrial town that made the most impression, mentioned in Evans, 1989. The present in the past of the Industrial Revolution. This picture, the picture that emerges from section 2.1 to 2.2 is quite a complicated one. In section 1, you've explored attempts to measure growth rates during the Industrial Revolution and the interaction between economic growth and the growing population. You learn that national statistics are necessary if we are to get an overview of industrial change, but they are hard to compile and interrogate. In section 2.2, you looked at a number of regions in Britain and how their economies change, regional variations, mean that local accounts of industrial revolution can differ from one another and spark historical debate, because change was not only rapid in some places and slow in others, but also different in each location. All this means that, perhaps understandably, there has been very significant historical debate about the Industrial Revolution. In this final section, you will explore some of the ways that historians have approached the Industrial Revolution and how these approaches have changed over time. In an influential article on the subject, leading historian David Cannadine has argued that the ways historians have interpreted the Industrial Revolution have reflected current concerns about economic change and its impact. And that is one reason it has remained so controversial. Canadine, 1984. Understanding how historical debates can change over time is an important aspect of studying history. The rest of your work in this section will be spent online looking at Canadine's article in detail. Section 2.4. Now go to the module website and complete 82.4, the present and the past English Revolution 1880 to 1980. This should take around half an hour. In the conclusion, this unit has explored the Industrial Revolution by looking at data on growth by investigating what happened in a number of regions in Britain. You'll recall from the introduction that the Industrial Revolution has been defined in terms of a massive increase in production, which Stearns attributes to two factors: the application of new sources of power to the production process, the increased scale in human organisation, including specialisation and the division of labour. How well does this definition fit with the evidence presented in this unit? From figures 2.1 and figures 2.2 showed the increase in production, particularly when population growth is factored in, were modest in the 18th century but did rise significantly after 1800. There was also evidence of both Stearns' factors in the application of machine power to the process of textile production in both Lancashire and Renfrewshire, and in the specialisation and the division of labour that were characterised of the Birmingham metal trades. On the other hand, you might also have noted that the power used to drive the first spinning mills was traditional water power and not steam power, which come to be widely used after around 1800. Industrialisation in Birmingham seems to have long relied on manual tools and methods. The great process of change had led some historians to question the time of the Industrial Revolution and argue that the revolutionary period happened after 1800, when growth rates picked up and the use of coal-powered steam engines became more widespread. If we look in, for instance, in relation to 2011, this view, what happened before 1800, was increased exploitation of the resources of a traditional society. But as we saw in Birmingham, it can be difficult to find turning points in what was long drawn-out process of change. Production did rise in the 18th century despite a growing population, and new methods of manufacturing began to spread. And if change accelerated after 1800, it both builds on early foundations and was by no means complete by 1850. If we wish to think of the Industrial Revolution as revolutionary, we need to accept it was a different type of revolution, where what's important is not the speed of change, but the scale of nature of the transformation. This process sometimes referred to as its historiography. What advances our knowledge of the past is an ongoing discussion between the historians. The new arguments are presented and new evidence unearthed. I hope you take this final section of the unit to two key points. First, it is important to note that this process takes place over time. So the question raised by one group of historians may set the agenda for the next. Thus, search for a takeoff period has encouraged much more quantitative study of growth rates and explaining the contrast between low growth and rapid change in some regions had led to much more regional approach to study of the Industrial Revolution. Second, as Canadine demonstrates so effectively, so the questions that historians ask are not removed from the times they live in. Much research into the past is related to current issues. We're on page 89, I believe. think. I'm not sure. Oh, yes, we are. Unit 3. Unit 3 of the rise of the working class. The aims of this unit will examine the social and political consequences of industrialisation for workers, investigate whether industrialisation led to the rise of indebted working class, introduce some debates among historians about the working class in the period of 1789 to 1840. In the introduction, page 98. In the unit, The Industrial Revolution, Unit 2, you have learned how the process of industrialisation and urbanisation transformed Britain into an industrial nation. In this unit, you examine how this transformation changed the lives of the people most directly affected by it, the working classes. Most people today are familiar with the term working class. You may already have an idea of its meaning. Roughly speaking, it commonly refers to people who earn a modest wage, often through industrial manual labour. But in 1789, there was no such thing as working class, and the term itself was not commonly used contemporaries. Did not think about wage earning labourers as belonging to one distinct, coherent social group. If anything, it was not the working class, but rather the emerging middle class or middling ranks that had become increasingly recognised in the 18th century as a distinct social group. By 1840, however, there is evidence that the working classes had become to be seen and to see themselves as a distinct social group. The period 1789 to 1840 has been described by some historians, in particular E.P. Thompson, 1695. As witnessing the rise of the working class, in this unit you examine this claim. Did the period witness the emergence of a coherent social group that identified itself and was identified by others, the working class? As with all historian debates, a range of different arguments have been put forward, some of which you will encounter below. Differing views often turn on the interpretation of particular sources, and hence in this unit you will also encounter a practice using a range of different primary sources. Class and working class. In the 19th century, the term class started to be used to describe the various social groups making up hierarchised society. The working class, a portrait, was famously described by the philosopher, economist, and revolutionary socialist Karl Marx, 1818 to 83, as the people who had no capital and derived their income from the scale of their labour and skills. In this unit, I prefer to use the plural working classes in order to highlight the diversity and fluidity of this social group. I define these working classes as those who work for wages, usually manual industrial labour, but also including artisans, craftsmen, and a wide variety of tradesmen. While some artisans could make a good living, working class incomes tended to be relatively low and unstable. This is in contrast to the growing middle class or middle classes, comprised of professionals, businessmen, merchants, and all the clerical and administrative professions associated with growth of manufacturing. In order to explore this data, the rise of the working class, in section 1, you'll first look at the lives of the working people in the period. As you'll see, the Industrial Revolution was gradually transforming their working practices and day-to-day lives. From a 21st century perspective, it is tempting to see this is a process of economic modernisation. But as you learned in Unit 2, the pace of change was gradual and uneven. Traditional ways of working and living often endured, even the growing industry and manufacturing sectors. It is also far from clear that the modernisation led to improved living and working conditions for the majority of workers. Thus, the idea that all working lives were simultaneously transformed by industrialisation in the same way appears unlikely. Given this, it might be easy to suppose that the notion of a coherent and self-aware working class emerging is correspondingly unlikely. In section 2, 3.2, however, you examine how continuing economic difficulties and social discontent led to a wide array of popular protests and political demands throughout the period. You will then investigate whether the growing political agency did indeed help to create a new sense of working class identity among the working people of Britain by 1840s. Working class lives, real wages and leisure. In Unit 2, you looked at some of the major changes that transformed the British economy in the period 1789 to 1840. The so-called Industrial Revolution gradually replaced traditional agrarian and socialised modes of production with a mechanised and interconnected industrial and economy, and the process of urbanisation saw cities expand to include almost half the population. Yet you also saw that these changes were very gradual and variable. Depending on location and industry, many areas of the country remained predominantly rural, and the dynamic growth of the cotton and iron industries was offset by slow development in other areas. In this section, you'll consider some of the ways in which industrial revolution impacted on the lives of working people. How significantly did the industrial revolution change daily life, and how uniform were these changes? In the mid 18th century, the vast majority of people in Britain lived in rural areas and made their living from farming. By the mid 19th century, the majority lived in towns and cities and were employed by manufacturing and industry. This implied a rapid, profound transformation of the working practices and domestic lives of many workers. Yet traditional occupants and old patterns of work and leisure also continued to survive well in the 19th century. The lives of ordinary people often changed in some ways for the better. Wages rose slightly over the period, as did literacy, but in other ways for the worse. Levels of child labour, working hours, and infant mortality all increased. This section starts by outlining some of the broad changes and then asks if they can be assessed as positive. What was the impact of industrialisation on the lives of working people, and were they better off in 1840 than had been in the 1780s? In the 18th century, the labouring class was primarily employed in agriculture and domestic service, with a significant minority of craftsmen, journeymen, and apprentices who manufactured shoes, clothing, furniture, ships, metal, and other goods. Production generally took place on a small scale. For example, textiles were spun, woven, and dyed manually by thousands of individual manufacturers. Working in workshops or in a home, metal production in Midlands and coal mining in the north-east of England were conducted on an equally small scale. However, as discussed in Unit 2, the established state of affairs was changing. This was in part because of the population of Britain increased dramatically in the second half of the 18th century, as you saw in this unit. Bliss was in it that dawned to be alive. In Unit 1, this population growth was fueled by innovations in agricultural production. These include, for example, crop rotation, the growing of different crops in succession on a given piece of land to avoid exhausting the soil of nutrients, selective breeding, and enclosures. The resulting rise in agricultural productivity led to a decline in the need for agricultural labour, and this, together with the huge increase in population, it created a large surplus of labour available for the manufacturing sector. Many workers left the countryside in search of employment. Providing the urban workforce necessary for effective industrialisation. Between 1809 and 1851, therefore, the population of the labour force employed in manufacturing, mining, and industry in Britain increased from 30% to 43%, while the proportion working in agricultural related activity dropped from 36% to 22%. Flood and McCloskey, 1981. At the same time, the factory system became widespread, largely due to the mechanisation of cotton spinning. Factories had begun to appear in the 18th century, and some cotton factories in the north of England and metal production factories in the Midlands could already employ as many as 1,000 workers in the 1770s. But it was the invention of the spinning jenny and the power loom in the late 18th century that truly revolutionized the process of cotton spinning and allowed them for mass production of cloth. As the production process was mechanized, it was also relocated away from homes and workshops. Workers now had to work factories housing the large spinning and weaving machines. And industrial towns attracted large numbers of people in search of employment. Children, often sent from workhouses or orphanages, were employed for small size and agility, with long working hours, often from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. Many mills had to provide dormitories for their workers. Discipline was often harsh, and accidents were not uncommon. But this does not mean that everyone was working in a very large factory. Factories employing 1,000 workers was still a rarity. By the early 1840s, few cotton mills could have employed more than 200 people, and most British industrial workers continued to operate in small workshops or at home. Cruzet 2006, but as you also saw in YouTube, even those more traditional forms of working class activities were transformed to some degree by industrialisation. To take a specific example, independent small scale producers survived in a highly mechanised textile industry, and, in fact, there were still almost 2,000 handloom weavers in 1835. Cruzet 2006, this was because domestic industry, by its very nature, was able to be flexible and responsive to a change of an economic environment. The entire family was usually involved, combining work with domestic chores and adapting to the change of needs of the family. However, as competition from factory produced cotton increased and brought prices down, traditional domestic industry often necessitated longer hours of work and more frequent employment of children in order to stay competitive and commercially viable. The traditional work of skilled tradesmen was also affected by the growing industrialisation and urbanisation of Britain. An exercise 3.1 will help you to explore this. Turning to reading 3.1, Charles Newman autobiography, located at the end of the unit. This is an extract from an unpublished memoir of the Charles Newman, 1799-1870. A carpenter born in Kent, educated at the Rochester Mathematical School and then apprenticed to a local carpenter. In 1817, he went to work in London, where he was employed as a journeyman carpenter during a period of great building activity, including a redevelopment of Trafalgar Square, as shown in figure 3.1. You will learn about the autobiographies as historical sources later in the unit, but for now, I would just like to note that this source has a few limitations. Like all autobiographies, it is one person's experience and point of view, which makes it difficult to draw general conclusions. In addition, we don't know why or when or whom Newman decided to write down his life story, and therefore we can't be sure how accurate his account is. Read the extract quickly and then again more slowly while thinking about the following questions. Jotting down brief points or notes. What other professions and ways to earn income does Newman mention apart from his own carpentry? How does Newman account reflect to the economic change he's studying to? This takes around 20 minutes. The answer we have here is this extract illustrates a variety of early 19th century working class occupants and sources income in urban environment. Newman was a carpenter, and he also mentions a pub landlord, Mr. Lee, who kept the White Lion, and a skilled artisan. Our landlord was a bookbinder by trade, as well as his employers. The rapid industrialisation and urbanisation of Britain provided work not only in the manufacturing sector, but also for skilled workmen such as Newman. Like many in the period, He left a rural area, in his case Kent, in order to find work in the city. His recollections testify to the tremendous changes hardly possible for anyone to imagine in the urban landscape of the period, from the beginnings of the use of gaslights in construction several major new buildings in London